It's time to set those winning lineups for week 3 of the fantasy football season. I'm Jen Piacenti at Sports Illustrated, and joining me today, our senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano. Fab, let's kick it off at the quarterback position. Who should we be locking and loading this week?
I'm going to go with Joe Burrow. Listen, he's coming off a bad game. He had 5 turnovers in week 1, but he's got the Jets this week. I get it. The offensive line has been an issue. He's been sacked 13 times already, but the Jets only have 3 sacks through 2 games. Quarterbacks have averaged just under 20 points per game against the Jets since week 13 of last year. So keep the faith, play Joe Burrow, and then keep the faith in Kirk Cousins. It's not Monday night, folks, okay? I get it. He was terrible last week against the Eagles, but this is a really good matchup against the Detroit Lions. Their defense has allowed an average of more than 26 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. Jalen Hurts, Carson Wentz, both put up big numbers against them, so start Kirk Cousins.
And it's also the highest game total of the week on SI Sportsbook, so I really like that call. Now, pivoting to quarterbacks that we should probably sit, you got a couple of guys here that maybe old man time is catching up with, and plus they're playing in the same game.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm going to start off with Aaron Rodgers. Listen, he was bad in week 1. And then last week he was okay, but I mean, he scored 15 points. Like, that's not really going to cut it from a fantasy football perspective. Then he's got to play against the Buccaneers. Their defense has allowed an average of 7.3 points per game to quarterbacks this season and 14 points per game to the position in their last 8 games dating back to last year. So beware Rodgers and beware Tom Brady. I can't believe I'm saying this, Jen, but he has averaged 9.9 points so far this season. He only had 1 game last year where he scored under 10. I don't know if Father Time is catching up to him, his off-field issues are catching up to him, but also keep in mind, no Mike Evans, no Chris Godwin. His top wide receivers could be Russell Gage, Rashad Perriman, and Cole Beasley, who the Buccaneers just signed. This could end up being a low-scoring game. If I'm in a traditional 1-quarterback league, I'm thinking about sitting Tom Brady. Can't believe I just said that.
Well, I can't really blame you. And by the way, is Julian Edelman, are his feelings hurt at all that they went for Cole Beasley? I don't know. I guess he's a little younger. All right, let's pivot to the running back position. Who should we definitely be starting in our lineups this weekend?
Love David Montgomery. Had a very good game last week in a loss to the Green Bay Packers. Averaged over 8 yards a carry, and he saw 50% of the touches. So this backfield committee with Khalil Herbert, well, it didn't happen last week. He's got the Texans coming up next. They've allowed an average of more than 28 fantasy points per game, the running back, since last week 13, 2021. So start David Montgomery and start James Robinson. Yes, this hurts my heart. I was big on Travis Etienne. I think a lot of us were this season, but Robinson's the guy, right? I mean, it doesn't look like anybody who's come off of an Achilles tendon surgery, but he's looked great. He has scored over 35 combined fantasy points in his first 2 games. He's seeing over 35% of the Jaguars' backfield touches, and I like the matchup against the Chargers. So James Robinson is back in the RB2 flex conversation.
Congratulations to all of you who drafted James Robinson, because that's going to turn out to be an incredible value for like the 3rd year in a row. I guess eventually we're going to have to buy into James Robinson. And you're right, coming back from an Achilles injury, but you have a guy on your sit list that is also coming back from an Achilles injury, plus one of our boys.
Yeah, and let's start off with one of our boys. I'm actually putting Zeke as my sit of the week at running back. I'm hoping I reverse jinx him and he has a big game, because I think this is less to do with Zeke and more to do about just the offense and the offensive line. So far this season, I mean, he's really done nothing. He looked good in week 1, limited carries. Last week did not look great. Tony Pollard was the better back. And how about this? He has only seen 4% of his carries with an extra man in the box. So it's not even like defenses are trying to stop Zeke at this point. And then also keep this in mind. In his 4 career games against the Giants in New York or New Jersey, he's averaged fewer than 14 fantasy points per game, and those games were in his prime. So Zeke is a risk for me, and so is Cam Akers. I had him as a sit last week. He surprisingly started for the Rams, but didn't do much, right? I mean, Darrell Henderson actually was the better back from a fantasy perspective. Akers averaged 2.9 yards per rush. That's terrible. So this isn't even about the matchup either. It's just about the fact that I'm not sure if Akers is going to continue to be a guy that we can trust on a week-to-week basis, like we did maybe in the past. For right now, I still have Darrell Henderson ranked ahead of him. If I'm starting a Rams running back, it's Darrell Henderson, but this thing is becoming a very confusing mess quickly, Jen.
I would be a fan, though, of starting Cam Akers in DFS because it's such a good matchup and you're going to get a great bargain price because everybody's very low on Akers, so it could be a contrarian play. But I agree with you, really tough to start him in your weekly lineups. Let's move over to wide receivers. You got a couple of stardom wide receivers that are also pretty good values on the DFS slate this weekend.
Right, and let's start with Hollywood Brown there for the Cardinals. He's been good so far this year, right? I mean, he's not putting up bananas numbers, but 27 fantasy points in his first 2 games. This should be a high-scoring affair. SI Sportsbook has the over-under at 50. And also, this is a strange stat because Jalen Ramsey plays for the Rams, but they have actually allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers lined out wide in their last 8 games. Brown runs right around 80% of his routes out wide, so I'd start him. And I also like DK Metcalf this week. And listen, folks, I know it's Geno Smith throwing him the football. DK's done nothing so far this year, but it's a good matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Their defense has surrendered more than 30 fantasy points per game to receivers lined out wide in the first 2 games of the season. So if you're ever going to have faith in DK, this is the week to play him as a flex.
And who are we sitting this week at wide receiver? It looks like a couple of guys that a lot of us were high on coming into the season, but they just haven't lived up to expectations.
It's a tough week for the sit-em wide receivers because so many wide receivers are just playing really well right now, right, Jen? So I'm going to go with JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, he's seen 11 targets in the first 2 games. He's been running his routes both out wide and from the slot. So you can't really gauge a defensive matchup based on that. But the Colts have given up the 10th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers as a position. And also, let's keep in mind, it's hard to predict which Chiefs wide receiver is going to be the guy to play on a week-to-week basis, right? I mean, who was it last week? Justin Watson. No one has Justin Watson. So JuJu is a fade or a risk-reward flex. Same thing with Elijah Moore, a player that I really liked coming into the season, and he's seen plenty of snaps. I mean, that hasn't been the problem, but he's been out-targeted by Garrett Wilson. He's tied with Corey Davis for targets in terms of the number 2 spot among Jets wide receivers. And the Bengals have allowed the fewest fantasy points to receivers lined out wide after the first 2 weeks. That's where Moore runs most of his routes. So if you've got depth at wide receiver, Elijah Moore should be on your bench. And suddenly, Garrett Wilson maybe should be put into your starting lineup.
Absolutely. Garrett Wilson, my top waiver claim for this week. And Elijah Moore, it's too bad. Joe Flacco, tons of dropbacks. They're putting the ball in the air. But maybe when Zach Wilson is back, we'll see a little bit more from Elijah Moore. But for now, he's definitely a sit-em. And I want to also focus in on your point about wide receivers. Interesting fact. In PPR leagues, 6 wide receivers have more points so far in the season than the top scoring running back. So when you're thinking about making a flex decision, you might want to start thinking about wide receivers in that role. All right, finally, Let's hit the tight end position. Who are we going to start?
How about Irv Smith Jr.? Right? In week 1, we had him as a sit. He did nothing. He barely saw any playing time. It was Johnny Mund. But then this past Monday against the Eagles, he went off. Had a very good game, scored a touchdown, might have scored a second if he didn't drop the pass from Kirk Cousins, and he ran 30 routes on 34 snaps. What do we want our tight ends doing? Running pass routes, because that's how they score fantasy points. He's got a matchup against the Lions this week, which is very favorable, so you can pick up Irv Smith and start him. And then Tyler Higbee. Hey, remember a couple of years ago, he was actually a very good fantasy tight end. Last year, came back to earth. Right now, no tight end in the National Football League has more targets than Tyler Higbee. Yeah, no, that's not a misprint, folks. He's got the Cardinals this week. They've allowed the most fantasy points to the position after 2 weeks. Now, I get it. They played Travis Kelce and Darren Waller, but still, as long as Van Jefferson is banged up, Tyler Higbee is going to be a very solid start for a position that's extremely thin.
And who are we going to sit at this thin, tough position this weekend?
I was wrong on Mike Gesicki last week. I also didn't expect Tua Tagovailoa to throw for 500 crazy yards and 6 touchdowns. So Gesicki was good. His dance moves were not all that great. He didn't do the gritty very well, but I probably couldn't do any better. He had a good game, but I would not be fooled by that game. Now he's got Buffalo, right? I mean, they haven't given up a touchdown to a tight end since week 13 of last year. They've also given up the fewest fantasy points to that position. So I'd fade Gesicki and Cole Kmet. I mean, listen, the guy is playing enough snaps to be productive. They don't throw him the ball. Like, this is a guy we thought was going to be the number 2 option for the Bears in the passing game behind Darnell Mooney. Well, Darnell Mooney's been non-existent, and so is Cole Kmet. I mean, that's been a big problem. 67% of his snaps, Jen, have resulted in a run play. What does that mean? They're not throwing the ball, and he's blocking. So maybe Cole Kmet pops here from time and again during the course of the season. It's not like the matchup is terrible against the Texans, I just can't trust him right now.
Yeah, this Bears offense is really confusing. I'm hoping we get a little more clarity this weekend, but right now it feels like the only person I'm willing to start is David Montgomery. And yeah, I would pick up Khalil Herbert as well, just to have some insurance for David Montgomery, since it seems like that might be the entire game in Chicago. Fabs, fantastic advice as always. If you're looking for start sits at every position, we have them, including defenses and kickers. You can find it at si.com/fantasy. But don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our fantastic video content coming out throughout the fantasy football season.